I wired $500,000 on a Tuesday morning, and I felt every single year it took me to build it leave my body in one breath. My name is Delphine Bryson. I am a 51-year-old woman who owns 2 properties in Atlanta, presses her bed corners tight every morning, and has never in her life spent a dollar she didn't account for. I say that so you understand what I'm about to tell you. The laptop was open on my kitchen table. Coffee to my left, still hot. The banking portal was already loaded. I'd been sitting there 20 minutes before I touched the keyboard. The amount was $500,000. Not savings, not an inheritance, not luck. That was 12 years of equity I had been sitting on across 2 Atlanta properties, converted into a wire transfer, moved deliberately, with full awareness of what it cost to build. I dropped out of school at 16 to care for my mother, Aura May. She had a heart condition the doctors said could be managed but never fixed. I didn't argue with them. I just came home, told my principal I wasn't coming back, and started figuring out how to keep us alive. I cleaned offices. I pressed hair in our kitchen for women who sat in the chair and told me their whole lives while I worked. I stretched every dollar until it was nearly transparent. Then came JJ, Jerome Johnson. I married a man who understood money from the inside. Watching him taught me things about capital and leverage and patience that no classroom would have given me. What he couldn't teach me was how to trust him. When that marriage ended, he relocated to Stone Mountain and took his particular kind of damage with him. I kept the lessons. I kept the discipline. I built the properties alone. If you're watching this right now, drop the time in the comments. I want to know what hour of the day this story found you. I want to tell you about my son. Daniel used to fall asleep at this same kitchen table doing homework while I braided hair for clients 2 feet away. At 14, he came to me with a spiral notebook and shaking hands. He had written a business plan. Full pages. His handwriting was still half boy then, but the thinking was sharp. I read every word. By the time he finished college, he had turned that 14-year-old's idea into something real. A logistics company built specifically for Black-owned businesses. He had watched my tenants struggle for years, trying to ship product without the infrastructure larger companies took for granted. He knew the problem from the ground because he had grown up watching me work that ground. At his graduation dinner, just the 2 of us that night, he was glowing in a way I hadn't seen since that spiral notebook. He talked about investors and pitch decks and a launch timeline with a certainty that made my chest ache. He didn't ask me for the money. I offered. I told him I wanted him to have the foundation I never had. He cried. I held his face in my hands the way I used to when he was small, and the world was still something I could protect him from. The next morning, I wired the money. $500,000 drawn from equity that took 38 years to build. When the confirmation appeared on the screen, I closed the laptop, picked up my coffee, and sat very still for a long time. What I felt in that moment was not fear. It was not doubt. It was the specific, quiet pride of a woman who had spent her whole life building something worth giving. That was 5 months ago. I have not been inside that building once. She arrived with a store-bought pie and a smile that never reached her eyes, and I told myself I was imagining things. 2 weeks after I wired that money, Daniel called on a Saturday evening. His voice had that particular brightness it gets when he wants something to go smoothly. He said he wanted to bring someone to Sunday dinner. I said, of course. I cooked a full meal, smothered chicken, rice, green beans from scratch, because that is what I do when someone is coming into my house for the first time. I wanted her to feel welcomed. I wanted to be fair. Kendra Price was pretty in a careful way, dressed well, spoke well. She set the pie on my counter and said, "I didn't want to come empty-handed, Mrs. Bryson," and smiled at me with her whole face except her eyes. I noticed. I noticed the way she touched Daniel's arm every time he spoke, like a comma. I noticed how she looked around my kitchen slowly, not admiring it, measuring it. I told myself I was being uncharitable. My son was happy. That was supposed to be enough. For 2 weeks after that dinner, I watched things shift in ways so small I almost talked myself out of seeing them. Daniel started using words he'd never used with me before. Optics, investor profile, brand positioning. Words that didn't sound like him. They sounded like someone coaching him from just outside the frame. When I called him, I could hear her in the background, not always speaking. Sometimes just present, the way a person is present when they want to know what's being said. Twice, she answered a question I had directed at my son before he could open his mouth. He laughed it off, both times. I did not. I started feeling like a tenant in conversations about a company I had funded with 12 years of my life. Then came the phone call that changed everything. 4 weeks after the transfer, Daniel called on a Wednesday afternoon. I knew from his first breath something was wrong. He was using his careful voice, the one he used as a teenager when he'd broken something and was deciding how to tell me. He said the company's legal structure had been finalized. He said Nadine, their attorney, had advised that listing personal family relationships in the documentation could raise red flags with investors. He said my name would not appear anywhere in the company's paperwork. Kendra had advised it. It was cleaner this way. He would take care of me when the money came in. He promised. I let him finish. Then I said, "Taken care of how, Daniel?" Silence. The specific kind that means a person hasn't thought past the speech they prepared. He said he'd make it right. He'd structure a return once Nextbridge was generating revenue. I told him I needed that in writing. He said he'd send something over. His voice was steady, but his words were moving fast. The way words move when they're trying to get past something without stopping on it. I said, "Okay, Daniel, send it over." He never did. I didn't call back to ask about it. I didn't push. I went to the kitchen drawer where I keep important papers, and I wrote the date and time of that phone call on a notepad. Then I wrote one line underneath it. He promised. Nothing in writing. I put the notepad in a folder. I put the folder in the drawer. I closed it. Some women would have called him back that night. Some women would have driven to that office and demanded answers. I understood something those women might not. That the moment you show a person what you know, you lose the only advantage you have. I was not ready to lose my advantage. 2 weeks after that phone call, Daniel invited me to dinner. I wore my good earrings. I should have worn armor. She looked me in my face and said it like it was nothing. And my son sat there and let her. The restaurant was Kendra's choice. Too loud, too bright. The kind of place designed to make certain people feel like they wandered in by mistake. I arrived on time in my good earrings and my navy dress, and I walked to the table where Daniel was already seated, with 2 men I had never met. Both younger than me, both in expensive jackets, both turning to Kendra the moment I sat down, as though she were the host, and I were a guest she had generously allowed. Daniel hugged me. His eyes said something his mouth didn't. I filed that away and sat down. For the next hour, I watched a conversation happen around me like I was furniture. Kendra led everything: projected revenue, acquisition targets, funding timelines, her voice smooth and certain, her hand moving across the table toward those 2 men with the ease of someone who had already decided how the evening would go. Daniel spoke when she left him space. He didn't leave me any. I am not a woman who needs to be the center of a room. But I had funded what was being discussed at that table with 12 years of equity, and not one sentence was directed at me. I waited. I kept my face still and my hands folded, and I waited for my son to say something that reminded me of who I had raised. Then I asked, simply, because I wanted to hear his voice give me something real. Daniel, when is the launch? The table shifted, not loudly, just the way air shifts when something is about to happen. Kendra turned to me with a smile so composed it must have taken practice. "Mrs. Bryson," she said, "it's tomorrow, but you're not invited. It's only for educated people." I heard it. Every word. The two men went still. Daniel's face moved through something. A flicker, just one. The man I raised pressing against whatever she had built around him. And then her hand came down on his arm. Gentle, deliberate. A period at the end of a sentence. And my son said, "She's right. You can stream it online." I said, "Okay." One word. I said it evenly, without a tremor, without looking away from him. I picked up my water glass and I took a sip and I set it back down and I sat at that table for 11 more minutes because leaving immediately would have told them something I wasn't ready for them to know. The drive home, I don't remember clearly. Radio off, hands on the wheel. The city moving past the windows like it had no idea what had just happened. I walked into my house and the first thing I saw was the dress hanging on my closet door. The one I had ironed that morning thinking Daniel might call and tell me to come. I had pressed every crease out of it. I stood there and looked at it for a long moment. Then I went to the kitchen. I opened the drawer. I took out the folder. I spread the printed messages across the table. Every text where Daniel had called this our company. Every promise that I was his partner. Every time he had written, "You'll never have to worry again, Mom." I read them one by one in the quiet of my kitchen at 11 o'clock at night. Then I stacked them, put them back in the folder, closed the drawer. I did not cry. I did not call anyone. I did not sleep that night either. I was too busy thinking. And a woman like me, when she starts thinking, that is not something anyone in that restaurant would have wanted to know. I put on the dress anyway. I don't know why I did that. I think some part of me still believed he would call. I was up before 6, made my bed, corners tight, the way my mother taught me. Then came to the kitchen and started the coffee. The phone was on the table. I didn't touch it. I moved around it the way you move around something that might be hot, checking it with your eyes without letting your hands get close. I had bought the dress the week before, nothing extravagant, just something that said, "I belong here," wherever here turned out to be. I ironed it slowly that morning, every panel, taking my time the way you do when the task is the only thing keeping you steady. Then I put it on. Sat back down at the kitchen table in the dress and drank my coffee. The phone did not ring. By noon, I took it off. Folded it the way my mother taught me to fold anything worth keeping, carefully, with intention. Hung it back in the closet. Made myself a proper meal. Ate it at the table. Washed the plate. Then I sat in the living room and waited for 7 o'clock. The live stream loaded on the first try. I almost wished it hadn't. The venue was unrecognizable from the College Park space Daniel had used those first months. Lights rigged across the ceiling, a full stage, flowers along the front tables, a room packed with people I had never seen in my life. All of it gleaming. All of it built on equity I had spent 12 years accumulating. I sat with my hands in my lap and I looked at what my money had made and I did not move. Kendra was in white, standing beside Daniel at the front like she had always been the architecture of this thing, and he was simply the face of it. She worked the room with her eyes before Daniel even reached the podium, greeting, connecting, positioning. She was good at it. I'll give her that. Daniel spoke well. He always could. His voice was steady and warm and certain. And I felt the particular grief of watching your child shine in a room you were told you couldn't enter. He thanked his professors, his team, his mentors, a man named Bernard Whitfield, who had believed in the vision from the beginning. I leaned forward when he said that name. I knew it. Not personally, but I knew it. Atlanta business circles are smaller than people think. Bernard Whitfield's name appeared on buildings, development projects, charity boards, the kind of man whose signature moved money and whose interest opened doors. I waited to hear more. Nothing came. He wrapped up. The room stood. The applause came through the speakers in my living room and filled the space around me, and then I reached over and turned it off. I sat in the quiet for a moment. Then I got up, called Claudette, and talked about her grandchildren for 45 minutes. She told me about her youngest school play, and I laughed in the right places and asked the right questions. And when we hung up, I sat back in the dark and did not move for a long time. I was not crying. I was calculating. Just before midnight, my phone lit up on the cushion beside me. A text from Daniel. 4 words. Hope you watched, Mom. I read it once, turned the phone face down. He called 3 times that night, twice the next morning. I let everyone go to voicemail. I wasn't ready to speak, not because I was broken, but because I was thinking, and I needed to finish thinking before I opened my mouth. I let those calls go for 3 days. Then I picked up. I was calm. I was kind. I told him I watched and that it looked beautiful. I did not tell him what I had already started doing. The next morning, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to my accountant, Wendell. The second was to a name I had written on a piece of paper and kept in the same drawer as the folder. Her name was Nadine Collier. I didn't ask anyone for a referral. I didn't want opinions. I wanted facts. And I went looking for them myself. 3 evenings at my kitchen table with my laptop open and a notepad beside it. I read about Georgia business litigation until my eyes were tired. I read about something called promissory estoppel. When a person makes a promise, another person acts on that promise, and the law says you cannot simply walk away from what you caused. I read about unjust enrichment. When someone receives a benefit they have no right to keep without compensating the person who provided it. I didn't understand every word, but I understood enough to know that what had happened to me had a name, more than one name. I found Nadine Collier through the State Bar of Georgia's online directory. I read her case history for 2 evenings before I called. Nothing on her website was soft, no warmth language, no promises of compassion. Just credentials and outcomes. That was exactly what I was looking for. I drove to her office in Decatur on a Thursday morning, parked, sat in the car for 4 minutes with the folder on the passenger seat. Then I picked it up and went inside. Nadine was smaller than I expected and faster than I was prepared for. She didn't offer small talk. She sat across from me, opened the folder I placed on her desk, and started reading. I watched her eyes move across the printed texts. Every message where Daniel had called this our company. Every discussion about building it together. Every promise that I would have an ownership stake once the structure was finalized. Every assurance that I would never have to worry. She didn't react. She just read. When she finished, she looked up and said, "Tell me about the property." I told her. Daniel had used my College Park property for 6 months as NextBridge's first operating space. No lease, no payment, no written agreement of any kind. My accountant Wendell had records documenting the fair market rate for that square footage during that entire period. She wrote something on her notepad. Then she said, "You have a case." She explained it plainly. The texts were evidence of promises made. The wire transfer was evidence of reliance on those promises. $500,000 moved after repeated discussions of partnership, ownership, and shared participation in the company. That was what made the documentation important. Georgia courts looked at conduct as well as paperwork, and conduct leaves a trail. The property usage on top of it was unjust enrichment, a concrete, documentable benefit received and never compensated. Wendell's records made it measurable. Then she told me what we were not doing yet. "We're building," she said. "I need every text message organized by date. I need Wendell's property records. And I need you to stop discussing anything about the company with your son." I asked her why. She put her pen down. "Because anything you say from this point forward is evidence, and I need you to give them nothing." I sat with that for a moment. The discipline of it, the particular restraint of a woman who already knew how to be quiet, but was now being asked to make silence into a strategy. I told her I understood. She walked me to the door. No warmth performance, no false reassurance. I respected that more than comfort would have given me. I drove back through College Park on the way home. The property sat on the corner the way it always had. Brick, front. The door Daniel had used for 6 months to build something he never put my name on. I hadn't been inside since he vacated it. I slowed down as I passed. I did not stop. Nadine told me to be patient. I told her patience was the one thing I had been practicing my whole life. What I didn't tell her was that I had already started counting. The world kept moving. I kept still. And in the stillness, I kept coming back to my mother. Nexbridge was growing. I knew because Daniel's name was appearing in places. A mention in an Atlanta business newsletter. A post Kendra shared about young Black entrepreneurs disrupting traditional industries. Her face in the photo beside his, like she had always been the origin of the thing. I read every word. I saved nothing. I gave Nadine everything she asked for, and I waited. Every few days, another article appeared, another client announcement, another photograph with Daniel standing beside people who looked increasingly important. The company was moving forward while my folder kept getting thicker. I watched both things happen at the same time. And while I waited, I thought about Aura May. I was 16 the morning I walked into my principal's office and told him I wasn't coming back. He was a decent man. He didn't argue, didn't lecture. He just looked at me with the particular tiredness of someone who had watched this happen before and said, "Delphine, you are one of the sharp ones. I hope you find your way back." I thanked him and left. I never went back. My mother was in the kitchen when I got home. She was sitting at the table the way she sat when the fatigue was bad, very still, both hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold. I told her what I had done. I watched her face move through something I didn't have words for then, and still don't have perfect words for now. It was grief and gratitude pressing against each other so hard they collapsed into a single sound, something between a breath and a cry. And she reached across the table and put both her hands over mine, and didn't speak for a long time. She lived 6 more years after that morning. The heart condition the doctors described as manageable took everything slowly, the way those things do. A little function here, a little strength there, until the person you love is living at half volume and you are learning to hear them anyway. Those 6 years taught me everything I actually know. How to read a utility bill and find the charge that doesn't belong. How to walk into a landlord's office without raising my voice and walk out with what I came for. How to set a table with what you have so that nobody sitting at it feels the lack. Aura May never stopped saying thank you. Not once in 6 years did she let a day pass without finding a way to tell me that what I had given up mattered to her. She said it in the meals she made on her good days. She said it in the way she watched me when she thought I wasn't looking. She said it out loud when she had the breath for it. When she died, I was 22 years old with no diploma and 4 years of education that had no certificate attached to it. I thought about that woman every day I was building what I built. Every property, every tenant, every dollar I moved with intention. All of it grew from what she gave me in those 6 years at that kitchen table. I gave Daniel $500,000 for the same reason I left school at 16. Same love, same impulse. The difference was that Ora May spent every remaining day of her life honoring what that sacrifice cost. Daniel spent months forgetting it. I sat with that distinction for a long time. Then I picked up the phone and called Claudette. This time I told her everything. The dinner, the words, Daniel's silence, all of it. The things I had swallowed the night I called to talk about her grandchildren. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Del, you didn't raise a bad son. You raised a son who made a bad choice. There's a difference. Make sure he understands that difference before you're done." I wrote it down on the same notepad where I had written the date of Daniel's broken promise. The next morning, I sent another batch of documents to Nadine. Then I read Claudette's words again. I read them every morning for the next 3 weeks while I waited. I had been patient for 5 months. Then the internet told me my patience was about to expire. Nextbridge was doing well. I knew it the way you know things you've been quietly watching. Not from Daniel, who kept our calls light and careful. Not from Kendra, who I hadn't spoken to since the restaurant. I knew it from the Atlanta Business Journal feature that a church member slid across to me one Sunday without saying a word. I knew it from the LinkedIn posts Kendra curated like a gallery. Every photo composed, every caption precise. 12 signed clients announced in a tone that suggested the company had built itself. I had met with Nadine 4 times by then. The documentation was complete. The text archive was organized chronologically, every promise dated and printed. Wendell had submitted the College Park property records. 6 months of fair market rate, calculated and documented. Nadine had reviewed everything twice. She told me we were ready. We were waiting for the right moment to file. I had attended my church, tended my tenants, visited Claudette once and let her feed me and talk about her garden. I had given Daniel nothing about the company. Our calls were warm and surface level, the way calls get when 2 people are both being careful. I was following every instruction. Then on a Tuesday evening, I opened LinkedIn and saw the post. Daniel and Kendra both tagged, a graphic with the Nextbridge logo. The caption announced that the company was in final conversations with a private investor for a $750,000 funding round. The investor's name was Bernard Whitfield. I sat with the screen in my hands and read it twice. Bernard Whitfield, the man Daniel had thanked by name at the launch. The man I had leaned forward to hear about and then waited on. 214 likes. Comments full of congratulations and fire emojis and people tagging other people in excitement about something my equity had made possible. I called Nadine at 7:30 that evening. She picked up on the second ring. I read her the post. She was quiet for 3 seconds. The specific quiet of someone confirming what they already suspected. Then she said, "This is the moment. If Whitfield signs, the financial structure gets significantly more complex, and a clean settlement becomes much harder to reach. His counsel will run a litigation search before closing. If there's an active filing when they search, he walks." I already knew what she was going to say next. "We file before he signs." I asked her one question, the only question that mattered to me. "Will this hurt the company permanently?" Nadine didn't soften it. "It will cause serious disruption. Whether it's permanent depends entirely on what Daniel does after." I put the phone down from my ear for a moment. Not long. just enough to sit with the weight of what I was about to authorize. I had spent 5 months building a case I hoped I would never have to use the way I was about to use it. I had spent 5 months hoping Daniel would find his way back before it came to this. He hadn't. I put the phone back to my ear and said, "File." That night, I cooked my mother's smothered chicken. The whole recipe, every step the way she taught me, the smell of it filling every room. I ate alone at the kitchen table, and I did not rush. I washed my pot. I went to bed before 9:30. I slept better than I had in 5 months. Nadine filed on a Tuesday at 8:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because she texted me when it was done. I was sitting in the parking lot of my church when the message came through. I read it once, put my phone in my purse, got out of the car. I had some thanking to do. The filing went in at 8:47 in the morning. By midnight, my son had called me 14 times. I let everyone ring. I stayed in church longer than usual that morning. Sat in the third pew from the front where I always sit, and I was still for a long time after service ended. The sanctuary emptied around me, and I didn't move until I was ready. There was nothing urgent waiting for me. Everything that needed to happen was already in motion. I was home by 11, changed my clothes, put on something comfortable, and started cooking. The phone sat face up on the counter the way I always keep it when I'm in the kitchen. I watched it the way you watch something you've already made your peace with. It didn't ring yet. That was fine. By 2 o'clock, it lit up with a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go. Then something told me to read it. 4 sentences. No. Greeting, no name at the bottom. But I knew before I finished the first line. Kendra. The sentences had her particular construction, precise on the surface, pressurized underneath. She said there had been a misunderstanding. She said she hoped we could speak before things went further. She said Daniel didn't deserve this. She said she was sure we both wanted what was best for him. I read it once, turned the phone face down on the counter, went back to my cooking. At 4 o'clock, Daniel called. I watched his name on the screen until it stopped. He called again at 4:17. I let that one go too. He was in panic, and panic moves fast and loud and without direction. I had nothing useful to say to a man moving that way. I would speak to him when he could hear me. I ate at 6, washed my plate, watered the plants along the kitchen windowsill the way I do every Tuesday, the pothos, the peace lily, the small succulent Daniel gave me 3 birthdays ago that has survived everything I've put it through. I moved through my evening deliberately, each thing in its order. At 9 o'clock, Nadine called. She didn't waste words. Bernard Whitfield's attorney had made contact late that afternoon. His counsel had flagged the active litigation during a routine pre-closing search. Whitfield was pulling out of the funding round. The $750,000 was gone. His attorney had been professional about it. No drama, just a clean withdrawal. Active litigation was an automatic disqualifier. That was simply how it worked. I said, "I understand." Nadine said she'd be in touch Thursday. We hung up. At 11, the calls started again. Daniel, 3 times in 20 minutes. Then a gap. Then 2 more just before midnight. I was in my bedroom by then, sitting up against the headboard with my Bible open across my lap. I could hear the phone from the nightstand, each ring filling the room and then releasing it back to quiet. I was not ignoring my son out of cruelty. I want to be clear about that. I was letting it ring because there was nothing I could say yet that would be both true and useful. And I had made a decision a long time ago never to speak into a situation until I had something worth saying. He was panicking. Panic is not a conversation. It is a weather system. You don't argue with it. You wait for it to pass. I checked the missed calls before I turned the light off. 14. I plugged the phone into the charger and set it face down on the nightstand. I slept. By Thursday morning, it was already clear the company had expected Whitfield's money to arrive. Nadine had received communications from opposing counsel that made one thing obvious. Losing the funding round had created immediate pressure. The company my equity built was standing on far less stability than it had been presenting to the world. And appearances, as I had learned, were Kendra's department, not the company's foundation. By the fourth day, I had 128 missed calls from my only child. I counted everyone. The first calls came in fast and short, the kind where a person dials before they know what they're going to say and hangs up when the voicemail answers because they can't say it to a recording. I recognized that pattern. Panic moves before the mouth is ready. Then the voicemails started. The first one Daniel left was nearly impossible to follow. I could hear him moving while he talked. Footsteps, a door, the particular acoustic of a man pacing a small room. He said my name 3 times before he got to a sentence. He said there had been a mistake, that he needed to explain, that nothing was what it looked like. His voice was high and fast, and I listened to the whole thing standing at my kitchen counter without moving. The second voicemail was quieter. That one was harder to hear than the first. A quiet Daniel was always more serious than a loud one. I had known that since he was 7 years old. He said he was sorry. He said it the way people say it when they mean the feeling but haven't yet understood what they're apologizing for. It wasn't enough, but I kept it. By the fourth day, his voice had changed into something that reached through the phone and found the part of me that remembered him at 10 years old, sitting at the kitchen table, crying over something at school that he didn't have words for yet. That same unguarded sound, that same rawness. I kept going about my life. I tended the yard on Wednesday morning. The front beds needed edging, and I did it slowly, deliberately, the work of my hands keeping the rest of me steady. Thursday, I drove to College Park to check on Miss Greta. She has rented from me for 9 years, and she has never once asked me a question I didn't want to answer. She took one look at my face when I came through the door, said nothing, and put a plate in front of me. I ate every bite. Friday evening, I had dinner with Tamara in Decatur. We've known each other since our boys were in middle school together. Over the years, we've celebrated birthdays, sat through funerals, and spent enough afternoons on each other's porches that explanations stopped being necessary. We talked about her work, her neighborhood, a trip she was planning. She didn't ask about Daniel. I didn't bring him up. Some kindnesses don't need to be spoken to be felt. I counted the calls that night when I got home, sat at the kitchen table with the phone in my hand, and scrolled through every missed notification. 128. I said the number out loud in the quiet of my kitchen just to hear what it sounded like. I want to tell you what that number feels like when it belongs to your only child. It isn't abstract. It sits in your chest like something physical, a pressure that your body registers before your mind gives it permission. Every missed call is a pulse you chose not to answer, and a mother's body keeps score of everyone. I felt all 128. I did not pretend otherwise. Then I put the phone in my purse, because 128 missed calls is not an apology. It is panic wearing the shape of need. And I had raised Daniel to understand the difference between reaching out because you are sorry and reaching out because you are scared. He knew the difference. I had taught him myself. I was waiting for the version of my son who knew better. On the 5th day, a car nobody recognized pulled into the lot outside Daniel's apartment building. I know because Tamara, who lives 2 streets over from him and walks that neighborhood most evenings, called me. She said, "Aunt Dell, there's a man sitting outside Daniel's building in a Lexus. Been there 20 minutes. Hasn't gotten out yet. I knew exactly who it was. I hadn't spoken to that man in 4 years, but I knew. Jerome Johnson sat in my driveway for 8 minutes before he knocked. I know because I watched the clock. I want to be honest about how I know what happened at Daniel's apartment before JJ came to my door. I don't know it from being there. I know it from what Daniel told me. Pieces of it over several conversations across the months that followed, assembled the way you assemble anything that happened without you. I believe it to be true. I'm telling it to you the way I understand it. JJ had been in Stone Mountain since the divorce. We had an unspoken agreement about distance. He kept his radius, and I kept mine, and for years, that arrangement held, without either of us having to say it out loud. The last time I had spoken to him directly was 4 years before that Tuesday. What I know is that he pulled into Daniel's lot, sat in the car, and then went up. Daniel let him in because Daniel was drowning and a life preserver doesn't ask for credentials. JJ was not warm when he sat down. He doesn't know how to be warm with his son, hasn't known how for years. And I say that without bitterness because it is simply true. But he was present. He sat at that table and he stayed. Daniel showed him everything. The company files, the bank statements, the legal notice from Nadine's firm with my name attached to it as the filing party. JJ went through it the way he goes through everything financial, quietly, completely, following each number to where it led. He has spent 30 years in investment. He knows what a financial structure is supposed to look like, and he knows what it looks like when something has been built to benefit one person at another's expense. He found it quickly. The ownership documentation that erased me entirely. The $500,000 recorded as operating capital with no return structure, no documentation of repayment, no acknowledgement that it came from me at all. The College Park property. 6 months of commercial use, no lease, no payment, nothing. Daniel told me JJ sat back in his chair and didn't speak for a long time. Then he got in the Lexus and drove to Southwest Atlanta. I saw the car from the front window, watched him sit there without moving for 8 minutes. I did not go to the door early. I let him come to me. When I opened the door, we stood there for a moment across everything that had accumulated between us. Years of distance, a marriage that had used itself up, a son we had raised in the space between our silences. He looked older. I imagine I did too. I let him in. We sat at the kitchen table. He told me what he saw in the financials. Every detail, plainly. The way he delivers information when he is being serious. No softening. No editorializing. Just the facts in their correct order. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I asked him one question. Why are you here, Jerome? He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at me. Because I went through those numbers, he said, and I saw every promise I ever broke to you. And I thought it was time one of us did something about it. I sat with that. I did not forgive him in that moment. Forgiveness is a separate transaction, and I wasn't doing that accounting that night. But I heard him. I nodded. Then I got up and poured him a cup of coffee and put it in front of him without asking if he wanted it. He wrapped both hands around that cup the way he always used to. JJ left that evening with 2 phone numbers written on a piece of paper, people who could help verify parts of the company's early history and document conversations that had already become important to the case, not for influence, not for favors, for the record. He didn't ask questions. He just wrote them down. 3 days later, Nadine called and told me the paper trail was getting stronger. And stronger was exactly what we needed. She tried to rewrite the story. Nadine didn't let her finish the first paragraph. Within 2 weeks of the filing, a letter arrived from Kendra's attorney. I know its contents because Nadine read it to me over the phone with the particular flatness she uses when something doesn't impress her. The letter argued that Kendra's role in Nexbridge had been advisory only, that she was a girlfriend who offered strategic suggestions from the sidelines, that the ownership documentation, the structural decisions, the positioning that had placed her at the center of a company I funded, none of it rose to the level of legal accountability. She was just a young woman who cared about her boyfriend's dream. Nadine's response was 12 pages. It referenced specific emails with dates and timestamps. It named specific decisions Kendra had been documented making, not suggesting, making. It outlined the sequence of events from the Sunday dinner at my house, to the documentation call to the restaurant, to the launch, each one supported by evidence that had been building in my folder for months. The advisory framing didn't survive the week. Kendra's attorney called Nadine 4 days after receiving the response. I don't know everything that was said. What Nadine told me was this. Her attorney advised her plainly that a trial would expose the full ownership manipulation in open court, that the outcome would be unpredictable, and that settlement was the more intelligent choice. That was not the end of it. According to Daniel, she spent the next several weeks insisting the filing was an overreaction. She argued that businesses required difficult decisions. She said investors expected professional distance. She said I was making everything personal. Every conversation came back to the same point, that none of this would have happened if everyone had simply trusted her judgment. Daniel told me those discussions grew longer as the pressure around Nextbridge grew heavier. The more documentation surfaced, the more defensive she became. The more questions appeared, the less interested she seemed in answering them. The professional doors closed more quietly. A financial PR firm she had been in conversations with for months paused discussions once the litigation became public record. An advisory position at an Atlanta accelerator program she had been pursuing was put on hold pending the outcome of the case. No dramatic announcements. No public statements. Just organizations deciding they didn't want unresolved litigation attached to their names. It happens more often than people think. Nobody had to make a phone call. Nobody had to pull strings. The filings were there for anyone doing due diligence to find. Then the personal collapsed last, the way it always does when everything else is already gone. Daniel told me later that Kendra went quiet first, not all at once. Gradually, her response time to his messages slowed. Meetings she normally insisted on attending suddenly became his responsibility. Calls she would once return immediately sat unanswered for hours, then days. At first, she was still there, still offering advice, still talking about strategy and optics and long-term positioning. But Daniel said something had changed. Every conversation seemed to focus less on saving the company and more on limiting damage to herself. He kept telling himself it was stress. He kept telling himself she was overwhelmed. He kept telling himself they were facing the same problem together. Then, one Friday evening, he came home and understood they weren't. Her things were gone, not dramatically, no confrontation, no final words spoken in a doorway, just absence where presence had been. A text message that said she needed space and wished him well. He called me from a gas station parking lot at 10 o'clock at night. I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights through the phone and the particular quiet of a man who has just understood something he can't ununderstand. He told me what happened in short, careful sentences, the way you speak when you are holding yourself together by will alone. I listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, I did not say what I could have said. I did not say I told you so. I did not say I saw this coming from the Sunday she walked into my kitchen with that store-bought pie. I said none of it because none of it would have given him anything he needed in that parking lot at 10 o'clock at night. I said, "Come home, Daniel." The line was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Okay." Daniel came home that Sunday. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had wired him $500,000 8 months earlier. and he looked like a man who had just woken up from something he couldn't name. I made him a plate. He didn't touch it for a while. Then he looked up at me and said something I had been waiting 8 months to hear. I'm going to tell you exactly what he said. He sat down at my kitchen table, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Some silences need to be honored before anything else can happen. I had put a plate in front of him. He didn't touch it. He sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at them the way a person looks at something they're trying to understand. I waited. I have always been better at waiting than most people know. He started once, a sentence that began with Kendra's name and the word advised, and then he stopped himself. I watched him stop himself. That mattered to me. He looked up and said, I let someone convince me that you were a liability. He paused. And I knew better. I knew you. I let her do it anyway. I did not move. He talked for a long time after that. He told me about the dinner, how he heard what Kendra said to me across that restaurant table and felt something break open in his chest and said nothing because he was afraid of what would happen if he pushed back against her in front of those men. He said he had told himself he would fix it later, privately, that it was a social situation and he would handle it afterward. He said afterward never came because he let it not come. He told me about the launch night, how he was at the podium and scanned the stream comments by reflex, looking for my name, looking for something from me, before it landed on him that I wasn't watching from a seat in that room or a comment section. I was sitting alone in my living room watching him on a television screen because his girlfriend had told me I wasn't educated enough to attend. He said the sickness he felt in that moment stayed with him through the entire reception, and he smiled through every minute of it. He told me about the 128 calls, how each one he made that went unanswered felt like a door he had locked himself and was now standing on the wrong side of. How he had sat in his car some of those nights and just held the phone after the voicemail picked up because he didn't know what else to do with his hands. I listened to all of it without moving, without interrupting, without giving him anything that would let him stop before he was finished. When the room went quiet, I asked him the question I had been carrying since the night of that phone call 8 months ago. I asked it slowly, face to face, so there was no space for misunderstanding. Did you know what you were doing, Daniel? Not Kendra, not the investors, not the pressure. You. Did you know? He looked at me for a long time. The kitchen was very quiet. Then he said, yes. One word. I sat with it. I want to be honest with you. That yes did not give me satisfaction the way people might expect. What it gave me was something more useful than satisfaction. It gave me a foundation. A man who can look his mother in the eye and tell her the truth about what he did is a man who can build something real on top of that truth. A man who will spend his whole life constructing things on sand. I told him I was not asking him to be perfect. I told him I had never needed him to be perfect. I needed him to be honest. He could rebuild from honest. He could not rebuild from excuse. Those were the only terms I had. He nodded. Then he picked up his fork and started eating. That night, after Daniel went to bed in his old room, kept exactly as it was, not because I was waiting, but because some things you just don't change. I sat at the kitchen table with the folder. I opened it. I read every text one more time. Then I closed it and called Nadine. I said, let's talk about what comes next. Not for me, for him. Kendra's attorney blinked first. I knew it before Nadine finished reading me the number. The offer came in on a Thursday morning. Nadine called me at her usual time. No preamble, just the facts in their correct order. Kendra's attorney had proposed a settlement figure. I listened to the number. It was less than $500,000. I already knew it would be. Nadine had prepared me for that weeks earlier. Civil settlements are not about full recovery. They are about documented acknowledgement, and the number on the table was not yet enough acknowledgement for what had been done. I asked Nadine if we could do better. She said, "That's why we kept the property." The College Park supplementary claim went in that same week. 6 months of commercial space used without a lease, without payment, without a single document acknowledging that the building belonged to me. Wendell's accounting records laid the fair market rate out cleanly. Every month calculated, every figure sourced. When that documentation landed on Kendra's attorney's desk, the initial offer moved. Not dramatically, but it moved. Then the financial disclosure came back and moved everything again. Nadine had mentioned weeks earlier that some of the preliminary records didn't quite match the story Kendra's side was telling. Nothing dramatic, just small inconsistencies. Expenses classified one way in conversation and another way on paper. Operational decisions attributed to Daniel in one place and to someone else in another. At the time, there wasn't enough to draw conclusions. There was only enough to keep looking. The disclosure gave her what she needed. Buried inside Nexbridge's internal records was a line item that had been there since month 2 of the company's operation, a recurring payment classified as a consulting fee. The recipient was Kendra Price. It was not a large amount, but it was documented. It was consistent. And it had been drawn from the same operating capital that my $500,000 had funded. From the very beginning, she had been paying herself from money that came from me, through a classification that had never been disclosed to me. Nadine added it to the claim without raising her voice. That is the thing about a precise attorney. They don't need volume. They just need documentation. Kendra's attorney went quiet in a way that said everything. The number moved again. I want to be clear about what the final settlement was and was not. It was a portion of Nexbridge's liquid assets. It was a personal financial contribution from Kendra, modest, but signed and documented and real. What it was not was the full $500,000. I had understood from the beginning that civil settlements rarely return everything. What they return is acknowledgement, a legal, documented, signed acknowledgement that what was taken, and that the person who took it has been held to account. I got that acknowledgement. But the most important term in that settlement was not a number. It was the condition I gave Nadine at the start of those proceedings, the one she had written down and carried into every negotiation. Any ownership interest, claim, authority, or control Kendra asserted over Nexbridge would be surrendered as part of the resolution. The platform code, the client contracts, the brand, every asset that made the company what it was, would remain under Daniel's sole control going forward. Kendra's attorney pushed back on it once. Nadine held the line. It stayed. I had not come to kill what my money built. I had come to be acknowledged as the woman who built it. Kendra signed on a Tuesday. Her attorney had advised her to. The alternative was a trial that would expose the ownership structure in open court with unpredictable results. She signed, and I did not need to be in the room when she did. I signed the same afternoon. Nadine shook my hand. I thanked her the way I thank people who have done something real, directly, without ceremony. Then I drove home through College Park. I pulled up to the property, and this time I got out of the car. I stood on the pavement in front of that brick building, and I looked at it for a long moment. Everything it had been, everything it was still going to be. Then I got back in the car and drove home. I told Nadine when we started that I needed Daniel to feel the weight of what he did, not just hear about it, not just apologize, but carry it the way I carried that live stream alone in my living room. I believe he felt it. Now I had one more thing to do, and I needed JJ for it. I called JJ on a Wednesday morning and told him I needed him at a table. He didn't ask why. He asked when. That told me something. I said, Saturday. My kitchen. Bring nothing except what you know. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he'd be there. Before he could say anything else, I said, This isn't about us, Jerome. It never was. He said, I know, Dell. We hung up. I called Nadine next, told her what I needed drafted. She asked 3 clarifying questions, the way she always does, precise, no wasted words, and told me she'd have a document ready by Friday. I thanked her and got off the phone. Saturday came gray and cool, the way Atlanta mornings do when the season is thinking about changing. Daniel was already at the table when Nadine arrived. He stood when she came in, which told me the version of him that knew how to conduct himself was fully back. JJ arrived 7 minutes later. He and Daniel shook hands in my kitchen doorway, not warmly, not coldly, just 2 men acknowledging each other across a complicated history they were both choosing to set down for the morning. I put coffee on the table and sat down. Nadine laid the document out and walked through every term out loud before anyone touched a pen. The structure was clean. A portion of my settlement recovery, not all of it. A defined and documented amount, going back into Nextbridge as a formal equity investment. Not a gift. Not a loan. Equity. With my name attached to it in writing, with reporting obligations, with terms that meant Daniel answered to something beyond his own judgment when it came to my contribution. His equity percentage, mine. The board of 2, JJ and I as named advisors, with documented roles and defined scope. Then the operating parameters, Metro Atlanta only. No national expansion until the foundation earned it. 8 active clients. 4 in pipeline conversations. Build from what was real rather than what looked impressive. Nadine read each section clearly. When she finished, she looked around the table and asked if anyone had questions. Daniel had 3. Good ones. Specific, financial, forward-looking. The kind of questions I had raised him to ask. I watched him read every page before he picked up the pen. He didn't look at me for permission. He read, he understood, and he signed. That was all I needed to see. JJ signed as advisor without ceremony. He uncapped the pen, found his line, and signed in the same quiet way he had done everything since the night he showed up at my door, without asking for credit, without making it about himself. I signed last. I want to tell you what it felt like to put my name on that page. My name in ink, on a document that had my son's name on it, and a lawyer sitting across from me, and every term spoken aloud before anyone agreed to anything. I thought about a hallway that smelled like floor wax. I thought about a 16-year-old girl who gave up every credential the world would have given her because love required it. I thought about what that girl could not have imagined sitting in that hallway. That one day she would build something worth putting her name on, and nobody would be able to take it from her because this time it was in writing. I thought about Aura May's face, what it would have looked like. Then I put the pen down. JJ stayed for dinner. It was not easy, and neither of us pretended it was. But he stayed at that table and passed the bread, and answered when Daniel spoke to him. And I watched my son look at both of us in the same room without the weight of our history crushing him. That was the thing I had protected him from without ever telling him I was doing it. After JJ left, Daniel washed the dishes. I made him. Some things do not change. I sat alone at the table afterward. I opened the drawer. I took out the folder, held it for a moment, the weight of everything it contained sitting in my hands one last time. Then I did something I hadn't planned to do. I'll tell you about it in the morning. I woke up on a Tuesday and made my bed corners tight. Same hands, same corners, same discipline my mother pressed into me before I was old enough to understand what discipline was actually for. I came to the kitchen and put the coffee on. The table was clear except for one thing. A copy of the new Nexbridge agreement, folded once. My name visible on the front page where it had always belonged. I sat down with my coffee and looked at it for a moment without opening it. I didn't need to open it. I had read every word 3 times before I signed it. I knew what it said. I just wanted to see my name there in the morning light, in my kitchen, at my table, the way it should have been from the beginning. I want to tell you what I did with the folder. The Sunday after the signing, I took it to the backyard. My neighbor, Mr. Kavanaugh, built me a small fire pit 3 years ago. Good brickwork. Solid. The kind of thing built by a man who takes quiet pride in what his hands produce. I hadn't used it much. That evening, I used it. I set the folder down inside it, and I stood there for a moment with a box of matches in my hand. I want to be clear about why I burned it. Not because I was forgetting. Not because I was pretending the last 9 months had not happened. I burned it because I was finished needing it. Those texts had done everything I asked of them. They had built a case, supported a claim, documented a truth that the law then acknowledged. The case was closed. The lesson had been delivered and received by the only person I needed to receive it. I didn't need to carry that folder into the next part of my life. So I let it go. I watched it until there was nothing left but ash. And then I went back inside and washed my hands. Daniel is back in the College Park building. The lease is documented, signed, filed. A proper agreement at fair market rate with my name as the landlord and his name as the tenant, and every term written in plain language. 8 active clients. 4 more in serious pipeline conversations. The work is slower than he imagined it would be at this point. It is also real in a way it never quite was before, and he knows the difference now. I watch him know the difference. JJ calls on Sundays. Not every Sunday. We are not pretending to be something we are not. But enough Sundays that Daniel has stopped looking surprised when I mention his father's name without weight attached to it. 2 people who share a son and have decided that the shared thing matters more than the old grievances. That is what we are. It is not romantic. It is not performed. It is simply true. Kendra, I'll say this once and leave it where it belongs. I don't know where she is. I hope she learned something from what happened. I suspect she didn't. But that is not my problem to carry, and I have set it down. I think about Aura May when I sit at this table. How she would have handled that restaurant. Loudly, I imagine, with language that would have cleared every table within earshot. She was not a quiet woman when someone she loved was being disrespected. I am not my mother. I am everything she built, and something she never got the years to become. I think she would have understood the difference between those 2 things. I think she would have approved. I picked up the phone and called Claudette. She picked up on the second ring the way she always does. I said, "I have something to tell you." She said, "I know. Tell me." So I did. I talked about myself, fully, without editing, without managing what I let her see. For the first time in longer than I could account for, I told her all of it. The whole 9 months from the kitchen table to the kitchen table, beginning to end. I was still talking when the sun moved past the window. The coffee went cold. The morning opened up around me like something that had been waiting a long time to be inhabited. I let it.